What would you do if you saw a soldier being denied his right to honor a fallen comrade? What if I told you that a decorated Army colonel escorting the remains of a young soldier was stopped at an airport, not because of missing paperwork, not because of security concerns, but because of something far more insidious? And what if I told you that in just a few hours, the world would be watching and the airline would regret every second of their decision? This is not just a story about a flight gone wrong. This is about a man who refused to back down, a system that got exposed in real time, and a moment that proved that justice isn't given, it's fought for. Stay with me, because by the time you reach the end of this story, you'll understand why millions of people demanded answers, and why this wasn't just about one soldier, but about something much bigger. Before we dive in, if you believe in standing up for what's right, in honoring those who serve, and in holding people accountable, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe, because stories like these need to be told. And now let's begin. The airport was alive with the usual hum of movement, families rushing to their gates, rolling suitcases trailing behind them, business travelers lost in the glow of their phone screens, children darting ahead of exhausted parents. The overhead announcements blended into the sea of noise, a chaotic symphony of departures and arrivals. Through it all, Colonel David Carter moved with a measured pace, his polished dress shoes striking the marble floor in steady, unshaken rhythm. His uniform was immaculate, every ribbon and medal meticulously placed. But today they felt heavier than ever, because today was different. Beyond the windows of the terminal, waiting on the tarmac under the open sky, was a casket draped in the American flag. Private First Class Jason Reynolds, only 21 years old, had given everything for his country, and Carter had made a promise, one that transcended rank, one that had nothing to do with orders or protocol. It was about honor, about duty, about ensuring that no soldier was ever left behind. He adjusted his hat, took a deep breath, and stepped forward. His path was clear, his purpose unwavering. All that stood between him and his mission was a routine flight. But routine had a way of unraveling in the most unexpected of places. As he reached the airline counter, he set his paperwork down with precision, presenting his military ID and travel orders to the airline representative. A middle-aged man with sharp eyes and an unreadable expression. For a moment, everything was as it should be. The agent, Ethan Harris, glanced down at the documents, fingers tapping against the keyboard as he processed the information. But then, something changed. A hesitation. A pause that stretched just a beat too long. Harris's gaze flicked up, not meeting Carter's eyes, but shifting slightly to the side, as if silently seeking reassurance from someone unseen. Carter noticed. He always noticed. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice even, controlled. Harris cleared his throat, forced a tight smile. "I'm sorry, sir. There seems to be an issue with your ticket. We won't be able to accommodate you on this flight." Carter didn't react immediately. Years of discipline had trained him to listen first, to observe. The stiffness in Harris's posture, the flicker of unease in his expression. This wasn't just an administrative mistake. He tapped the stack of papers gently. "Everything here is in order. Military orders, ID, confirmation code. Check again." Another glance to the side. A brief, almost imperceptible shift in weight. Then the rehearsed line. "It's a security policy, sir. We can't override it." Security policy. Carter had been in the military long enough to know that phrase could mean 100 different things, and often it meant nothing at all. His jaw tightened, but his tone remained measured. "That's interesting, because I've flown dozens of times in this capacity. I know the policies, and none of them prevent a military escort from boarding a flight. So why don't you tell me the real reason?" Harris stiffened. The forced smile faltered just slightly before snapping back into place. "I'm afraid I can't say more, sir. It's just protocol." There it was again. Protocol. Policy. Words designed to obscure rather than clarify. Carter inhaled slowly. He had navigated war zones, negotiated in foreign territories, de-escalated conflicts in situations far more volatile than this. But this wasn't about him. This was about Reynolds, about a young man who had given his life in service to his country. And now the system, whether through incompetence, indifference, or something more insidious, was standing in the way of bringing him home. He wasn't about to let that happen. The line behind him had begun to stall, the murmurs of impatient travelers turning into hushed whispers as people took notice of the uniformed officer being denied his flight. Carter straightened his posture, his presence commanding the space around him. "I need you to explain this to me," he said, his voice edged with quiet authority, "because I don't accept vague answers, and I don't accept policy as an excuse when it comes to fulfilling a soldier's final journey home." Harris swallowed, glancing nervously at his screen, then at the other airline employees standing just behind him. The weight of the moment was growing, pressing down like a held breath. The longer he hesitated, the clearer it became. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't about security. This was about something else entirely. And Carter was about to make sure the whole world saw it. The murmur in the terminal was no longer just background noise. It had transformed into something charged, something alive. The air itself felt heavier, thick with expectation. People weren't just standing in line anymore. They were watching. Carter could feel their eyes on him, felt the shift in the room as more and more travelers began tuning into what was happening. The ones who had been too focused on their own itineraries were now lowering their phones, turning their heads. A woman adjusting her toddler's jacket paused mid-motion, brows furrowing. A businessman checking his watch looked up, sensing the strange gravity pulling everyone's attention toward the airline counter. And at the center of it all, Colonel David Carter stood motionless, every muscle controlled, every breath measured. Harris, the airline agent, was crumbling. It was in the way his fingers tapped anxiously against the counter, in the way his throat bobbed as he swallowed. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to being questioned like this. He had expected compliance, expected Carter to sigh, step aside, accept whatever excuse was handed to him. But Carter wasn't going anywhere. He kept his voice low, steady, yet it cut through the growing tension like a blade. "I asked you a question," Carter said. "Who made this rule?" Harris flinched ever so slightly. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Behind him, the supervisor shifted, his expression carefully neutral, but Carter caught the faintest twitch in his jaw, a sign of discomfort. The supervisor wasn't sure how to handle this anymore. He was weighing his options, calculating damage control. Carter gave him no room for maneuvering. "You said this was policy," he continued, his gaze sharp as steel. "But we both know there's no airline policy that prevents a military escort from boarding a flight. So I'll ask again. Who made this rule?" Silence, and then a small, sharp inhale from someone in the crowd. A woman in a navy blazer, her phone raised slightly, recording. Others followed suit, holding up their screens, fingers swiping, typing, live streaming. The shift was irreversible now. The supervisor finally spoke, his voice smooth, practiced, the kind of tone used by people accustomed to quelling complaints before they could spiral out of control. "Sir, this is a simple misunderstanding. We're just following standard procedure. It's nothing personal." Nothing personal. Carter let those words settle in the air for a moment, letting them fester, letting the crowd digest them. Then he gave a small, humorless smile. "Interesting choice of words," he mused, tilting his head slightly, "because I never suggested this was personal." A ripple of murmurs moved through the gathering onlookers. The supervisor stiffened. Harris looked visibly uncomfortable now, his collar damp with sweat. The Marine veteran standing a few feet away, the one with the USMC emblem stitched onto his jacket, stepped forward slightly. His voice was low, but it carried. "I don't buy it," he said. "I've flown 100 times in uniform. I've never seen an officer on assignment get turned away." Another voice joined in, a middle-aged woman in a denim jacket. "Yeah, what's the problem? He has all his paperwork." Carter didn't turn to acknowledge them, but their presence mattered. Their voices mattered. He took a deliberate step forward, his presence commanding without aggression, his next words measured but cutting. "Let's be honest," he said, his gaze locking onto the supervisors. "This isn't about paperwork. It's not about protocol. It's about perception." The supervisor's eyes flickered. Bullseye. Carter kept going, his voice unwavering. "Because if I looked different, if I was someone else standing in this exact same spot, You and I both know we wouldn't be having this conversation. A sharp inhale from someone in the crowd, a low murmur. The supervisor opened his mouth, closed it. Harris flinched. A man in the back, an older gentleman with silver at his temples, muttered under his breath, "Damn right." And that was the moment it broke. The moment it went from a tense conversation at an airline counter to something more. A woman near the gate entrance raised her voice, clear and determined. "Excuse me, can someone actually explain why this man isn't allowed to board?" Another man pulled out his phone. "This is messed up. I'm tweeting this right now." A younger guy in a hoodie, eyes glued to his phone, whistled low under his breath. "Yo, this is already blowing up." Harris's fingers twitched against the keyboard. The supervisor's nostrils flared slightly. They were losing control of the narrative. Carter could feel it, see it, the weight shifting. And then, a voice from the back of the line, steady, deliberate. "I think we all know the answer." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was loaded, a collective understanding. Harris stiffened. The supervisor pressed his lips together. Carter exhaled, slow and even. "I'll ask one last time." His voice was sharp as steel, but beneath it was something else. Something far more dangerous. Certainty. "Are you going to do the right thing?" And in that moment, Carter knew. This fight wasn't just his anymore. The tension in the terminal had thickened to something almost tangible. The quiet hum of airport life had dulled to near silence, replaced by the charged energy of a moment teetering on the edge of eruption. Colonel David Carter stood his ground, his body a pillar of unwavering certainty. His posture was composed, but his mind was sharp, calculating. Every breath, every shift in the room, every flicker of hesitation in the airline staff, he took it all in, reading the battlefield just as he had in far more dangerous places. The airline supervisor, his name tag read Robert Kessler, was unraveling, though he tried to maintain his professional veneer. His hands flexed, his gaze flickering to the growing number of phones held up, their cameras capturing everything. He knew, they all knew, that this was slipping beyond their control. And yet he hesitated, because admitting what was happening meant acknowledging something far worse than a policy issue. It meant admitting that their so-called rules weren't written in ink, but in bias. Carter knew this, and he was done playing their game. He took a deliberate step forward, his voice dropping just enough to force Kessler to truly listen. "You're out of moves." The words were simple, but they landed with the weight of a gavel striking a courtroom bench. Kessler's jaw tightened. Carter continued, voice smooth, controlled, but edged with something lethal. "If you deny me this flight, you're not just making a mistake. You're making history." Kessler's fingers twitched. Harris, the airline agent, looked as if he wished he could sink into the floor. Carter tilted his head slightly. "Because let's be clear, this moment?" He gestured to the cameras, to the faces in the crowd. "It's already bigger than you." A murmur rippled through the bystanders. A woman with curly dark hair standing a few feet away lifted her phone higher. "Sir, just so you know, you're live right now. About 20,000 people are watching." Kessler paled. The Marine veteran in the crowd folded his arms. "So what's it going to be, buddy? You digging your hole deeper, or are you fixing this now?" Kessler exhaled sharply, shifting his weight. Carter saw it, the split-second calculation behind his eyes, the desperate attempt to find a way out of this without admitting fault. So Carter decided to remove his last excuse. "Let's do this your way," he said, slow and deliberate. "Let's pretend, just for a second, that this is about policy, that there's some shadowy airline regulation I'm somehow violating." His tone sharpened, his next words slicing through the air. "Explain it to me." The room hushed. Kessler blinked. "Excuse me?" Carter stepped closer, his presence almost suffocating now. "Explain the policy. Detail it for us. Help us understand." He glanced around, raising a brow. "I'm sure the passengers here would love to know." A chuckle rippled through the crowd. Someone muttered, "Yeah, go ahead. Educate us." Kessler stiffened. His mouth opened, then closed. Harris's fingers trembled against the keyboard, because there was no policy, at least not one they could say out loud. Carter's eyes never left Kessler's. "Nothing?" No explanation. He let the silence stretch, let it fester. That's interesting. The Marine veteran let out a low whistle. Damn, that's what I thought. More murmurs, more shifting. The energy in the room was turning against them. And Kessler knew it. Carter softened his tone just slightly, pressing in for the final blow. Fix it? Now, because the only thing worse than what you're doing? He let the words settle, let Kessler feel their weight. Is doubling down when the world is watching. A pulse of silence. Then without a word, Kessler turned sharply, motioning Harris toward the computer screen. Harris scrambled, typing furiously. Within seconds, the printer whirred to life. A boarding pass slid out. The tension in the air snapped like a wire pulled too tight. Kessler grabbed the ticket, walked back toward Carter, and placed it on the counter with a clipped, forced politeness. Enjoy your flight, Colonel. Carter didn't move to take it. Not yet. Instead, he let the moment stretch, let the weight of what had just happened sink into the room, into the crowd, into the very air itself. Because this wasn't about the boarding pass. This was about accountability. And Kessler had just been forced to face it. A voice in the crowd broke the silence. A woman, quiet but firm. That's right. Respect our soldiers. A few murmurs of agreement followed, some nods, some whispered conversations. But it wasn't just words anymore. It was a shift. Kessler's lips pressed into a thin line. He knew Carter had won. He knew this wouldn't go away. Carter finally picked up the ticket. He gave Kessler one last look, steady and piercing. I hope you remember this moment. Kessler didn't respond. Carter turned, adjusting his hat, and without another word, he walked toward the gate. Not as a man who had won a fight, but as a man who had forced the world to pay attention. But for the airline, this was only the beginning. The terminal was no longer just a transit point. It had become an arena, a place where truth clashed against excuses, where power struggled against accountability. Carter could feel it, the shift, the weight of every eye in the room now focused entirely on this moment. It wasn't just passengers waiting to board their flights anymore. It was an audience. It was a jury. And Carter? He stood at the center, unshaken. His heartbeat was steady, his breathing controlled. Years of military service had trained him for pressure, for conflict, for the sharp edge of confrontation. But this wasn't a battlefield in a foreign land. This was home. And yet, he was being made to fight for something as simple, as fundamental, as respect. Supervisor Robert Kessler had lost the upper hand. He knew it. Carter knew it. The entire damn airport knew it. And yet the man still clung to the remnants of control, like a captain standing on the deck of a sinking ship, refusing to admit the water was already at his ankles. Kessler cleared his throat, attempting to salvage what little authority he had left. We sincerely apologize, Colonel Carter. This was an unfortunate misunderstanding. Carter didn't let him finish. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. No! One word. It landed heavier than a shout ever could. This wasn't a misunderstanding. Kessler's Adam's apple bobbed in a dry swallow. Carter took a step forward, controlled, deliberate. He wasn't looming. He wasn't threatening, but he was a presence, and Kessler felt every inch of it. A misunderstanding, Carter continued, his voice sharp as steel, is when you hand someone the wrong boarding pass. A misunderstanding is when a flight is delayed without warning. He tilted his head just slightly. A misunderstanding is not when a decorated officer, escorting a fallen soldier home, is denied his flight under the guise of policy. Silence. The tension in the air crackled like a storm waiting to break. Behind Carter, the Marine veteran muttered under his breath, "Damn right." Another passenger, an older woman in a denim jacket, crossed her arms. This isn't about policy. We all see that. Kessler's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. But nothing came out, because Carter was right, and Kessler had no defense. The weight of dozens of recording phones, the murmurs of an angry, unified crowd pressing closer. It was suffocating. It was inescapable. And then a shift. Not from Kessler, but from behind him. A man, tall, commanding, moving with the kind of precision that only came from a lifetime of discipline. A navy blue suit, a military ID clipped neatly to his pocket. And just like that, the balance of power tipped. The crowd stilled as the man stepped forward, his footsteps calm but authoritative. He didn't hesitate, didn't falter. This was a man used to handling problems. Carter met his gaze immediately. He didn't need to check the name on the badge. He already knew. The man extended his hand. "Colonel Carter." Carter took it, his grip firm. "Major Thomas Beckett, Department of the Army." And just like that, the airline's illusion of control shattered. Kessler turned, the color draining from his face. "Major, I assure you—" Beckett raised a single hand, the kind of gesture that meant you're done talking. "Colonel Carter will not be flying commercial." His words were crisp, efficient, a decision, not a discussion. "The Pentagon has arranged for a private military transport. His escort mission will continue without interruption." A beat of silence, and then the reaction. Passengers exhaled, some with relief, some with outrage, because now there was no hiding it. This wasn't about security, this wasn't about logistics, this was about power, about bias, about a system that had tried to flex against the wrong damn person. And now, the system had lost. Kessler was frozen. He had no more moves left. No cards to play. He could do nothing but stand there, humiliated, as Carter reached down, adjusted his hat, and didn't move. Not yet. Instead, he let the moment breathe. Let Kessler feel it. And then finally Carter spoke. "I want you to remember this moment." Kessler stiffened. Not because of the cameras, not because of the backlash that's coming your way. He took a step forward, his voice dropping lower. "I want you to remember it because next time you find yourself in this situation, you'll have a choice." He held Kessler's gaze. To do the right thing, or to be remembered for the wrong one. Silence. Kessler didn't respond, because there was nothing left to say. Carter exhaled slowly, then turned back to Beckett. "When do we leave?" Beckett checked his watch. "Your transport is already waiting, Colonel." Carter nodded once. Then without another word, without looking back, he walked away. And behind him, the airline was left to deal with the firestorm they had just ignited. Carter strode through the sterile corridor, the rhythmic sound of his boots echoing against the tile floor. The scent of industrial-grade cleaning solution hung in the air, but it did little to clear the weight pressing down on his chest. Major Thomas Beckett walked beside him, his expression calm yet knowing. Neither man spoke. There was no need for words. Behind them, the chaos of the terminal was still unfolding. The whispers, the indignant murmurs, the sea of raised phones capturing the moment. But Carter did not look back. He had fought his battle. Now it was time to complete his mission. The corridor led to an unmarked door, guarded by two military personnel standing at rigid attention. As they stepped aside, Beckett keyed in a security code. The door slid open with a low mechanical hiss. Beyond it, the world was different. Gone was the chaos of the airport terminal. Gone were the overhead announcements, the anxious energy of travelers. Instead, the sky stretched wide and golden, the last light of day casting long shadows across the private military hangar. And in the center of it, waiting beneath the fading sun, was the aircraft that would carry Private First Class Jason Reynolds home, a C-130 Hercules. Its engines thrummed in idle, a steady, unyielding pulse, a sound of certainty, of purpose. Carter exhaled slowly as he stepped onto the tarmac. His shoulders squared, his pace never faltered. But in his chest, something tightened, because waiting at the base of the aircraft ramp, standing in quiet reverence, was a six-man honor guard. They weren't here for him. They were here for Reynolds. The young soldier's flag-draped casket was already positioned at the foot of the ramp, gleaming under the amber light of dusk. Carter stopped. For the first time since stepping into the terminal hours ago, he allowed himself a pause. The world had erupted behind him. But here, in this moment, there was silence. There was respect. And this was all that mattered. He stepped forward, his gloved hand reaching out, fingertips grazing the fabric of the flag. Cool to the touch, pristine, unyielding in its meaning. Behind him, Beckett remained still, giving him his space. But Carter could feel his presence, not as a superior officer, not as a bureaucratic entity sent to fix a mistake, but as a soldier who understood. Carter's throat tightened for just a second before he pulled in another steady breath. Then, with the precision of a man who had done this before, but had never once grown numb to it. He gave a sharp nod to the honor guard. "Let's take him home." The men lifted the casket in perfect synchronization, their movements sharp, controlled. Carter walked in step beside them, ascending the ramp as the military transport prepared to leave the ground. And as the doors closed behind him, shutting out the world below, Carter knew one thing with certainty. The battle inside the airport was over, but for the airline, the war was just beginning. Far from the silent reverence of the military hangar, chaos reigned inside the airline's corporate headquarters. A sleek, modern boardroom, floor-to-ceiling windows, minimalist decor, had become a war room. Screens lined the walls, displaying live analytics from Twitter, Facebook, YouTube. Numbers ticked upward at an alarming rate. The public relations director, a woman in her early 40s with a carefully curated image of control, wiped a bead of sweat from her temple. "We need to get ahead of this." The CEO, a seasoned executive who had weathered many storms, sat stone-faced. He laced his fingers together, staring at the reports in front of him. "How bad?" A junior analyst, young, nervous, hesitated before answering. "Sir, it's bad." The senior crisis manager clicked a remote, bringing up a projection chart. "Stock has already dropped 5.2% in the last 2 hours. If this continues into tomorrow's trading cycle, we're looking at potential multi-million-dollar losses." Silence. Then a single, sharp exhale from the CEO. The vice president of legal affairs, a sharp-suited woman in her 50s, interjected. "We need to be careful. If we admit fault—" "We don't admit fault," the CEO cut in, his voice cool but firm. "We frame it as a miscommunication." The PR director flipped open her laptop, pulling up a draft statement. "We sincerely regret the unfortunate miscommunication that occurred at airport name. We have the utmost respect for our military personnel and are reviewing our internal procedures to ensure such incidents do not happen again." She looked up, waiting for approval. Silence stretched. Then, a quiet, humorless laugh from the far end of the room. The head of crisis management, a seasoned veteran in the field, shook her head. "That's not going to cut it." The PR director blinked. "Excuse me?" The crisis manager leaned forward. "We all saw the video. You really think the public is going to buy miscommunication when there's a 10-minute clip showing exactly what happened?" The legal team shifted uncomfortably. The CEO rubbed his temples, exhaling. "If we admit wrongdoing—" "We don't need to admit wrongdoing," the crisis manager countered. "But we sure as hell need to do more than that generic statement. The public is pissed, and pissed-off customers don't buy plane tickets." The CEO's jaw clenched, because she was right, and outside these walls the storm was only growing. As Carter's C-130 lifted into the evening sky, the firestorm below was unstoppable. The video had reached millions. Outrage had spread like wildfire. Hashtags were trending: "Let him fly," "Honor our heroes." About perception, the veterans community mobilized. "We stand with Colonel Carter. No soldier should be denied dignity. This is unacceptable." Politicians weighed in. A U.S. senator, a former Marine, tweeted, "This is a disgrace. A soldier's final journey should be met with honor, not corporate red tape. We will be demanding answers." And then, the final nail in the coffin. A former airline employee came forward anonymously. "This isn't the first time. There's a pattern. They just never got caught like this before." The internet exploded, and inside the airline's boardroom, the CEO realized the truth. They weren't dealing with a PR issue. They were dealing with a disaster. Inside the C-130 Hercules, the cabin was dimly lit, the only sounds coming from the steady hum of the engines and the soft rustling of the flag-draped casket secured near the rear of the aircraft. Carter sat near the bulkhead, hands clasped, staring ahead but seeing nothing. His mind was still in the terminal, still in the fight. His body was here, flying at 35,000 feet above the earth. But his thoughts? They were back in that moment when he had locked eyes with Kessler, when he had spoken the truth so plainly that it had left no room for argument. Next time you find yourself in this situation, you'll have a choice. Would Kessler remember those words? Would he change? Or would he simply fade back into the system, waiting for the next moment when he could wield power over someone else. Carter exhaled slowly, forcing himself to push those thoughts aside. Because the mission wasn't over. He turned his gaze toward the casket. The young soldier lying inside had given his life. And right now, thousands, millions of people were demanding answers for why his final journey had been disrupted. But Carter knew one thing for certain. This time, the world wasn't going to let it slide. 3 hours after the incident, inside the executive boardroom of the airline's corporate headquarters, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. The CEO, a man known for his calculated decision-making, was pacing near the windows, his phone in hand. He wasn't speaking, just listening, jaw clenched, nodding as the voice on the other end of the line delivered bad news after bad news. When he finally hung up, he turned back to the assembled crisis team. His voice was calm, too calm. "We're in free fall." No one spoke, because they all knew it was true. The PR director looked sick. "Sir, we need a stronger response." The CEO held up a hand. "How bad is it?" The chief financial officer adjusted his glasses, swallowing before he spoke. "Stock has dropped 8.4% since the video went viral. Analysts predict it could fall another 5 if we don't get ahead of this." The head of investor relations interjected, her voice tight. "3 of our major sponsors are already reconsidering their contracts. If we lose them, we could be looking at tens of millions in lost revenue." The CEO pressed a hand to his temple. Then the real bombshell landed. The legal counsel cleared her throat. "I just got off the phone with the Senate Subcommittee on Veterans Affairs." Every head turned toward her. She inhaled deeply. "They're opening a formal investigation into potential discrimination against military personnel. We've been subpoenaed for internal communications." The room plunged into silence. This was no longer a PR disaster. This was a crisis of survival. While the executives scrambled, something even worse was brewing online. Because while the airline tried to control the fallout, someone from inside was about to make things even worse for them. A former employee, someone who had worked in airline security for over a decade, came forward anonymously. His post was simple. "This wasn't the first time. It's just the first time they got caught. There's a pattern." He attached screenshots of internal memos, policies that weren't written as outright discrimination, but that showed clear bias in how security concerns were selectively applied. The internet exploded. "Boycott Airline" began trending alongside "Jar Let Him Fly." Within an hour, major news outlets picked up the leak. A former airline employee went on live TV. "I worked for this airline for 12 years. I saw firsthand how they treated certain passengers differently. We were never told outright, but we all knew." And just like that, this wasn't just about Carter anymore. It was about every veteran, every passenger who had been mistreated and ignored. The public had just turned this into a movement. By the time the airline's board of directors convened an emergency session, it was clear there was no salvaging the situation. The CEO tried to hold his ground, tried to insist that they just needed better PR, a stronger apology. But the investors weren't listening anymore. One of them, a man who had remained quiet through most of the meeting, finally spoke. "We're not debating whether we have a problem. We're debating how much worse it will get if we don't act now." The other executives shifted uncomfortably because they already knew what needed to happen. And so, after 12 years at the helm, the CEO of the airline, once seen as untouchable, was forced to step down. But for the public, that wasn't enough, because now they wanted real change. The C-130. Hercules descended smoothly from the night sky, its engines humming a deep, familiar rhythm. The world outside was silent. No impatient crowds, no flashing cameras, no chaotic murmurs of an airport terminal buzzing with scandal. Instead, the aircraft touched down onto the solid, unyielding asphalt of a military airstrip, where the only presence was those who understood what sacrifice truly meant. Carter felt the landing in his bones. Not because of turbulence. The ride had been steady, controlled, almost eerily smooth, but because he knew deep down that this was the last stretch of a journey that should have never been interrupted. A soldier was going home, and Carter was here to make sure it happened the right way. He remained seated as the engine slowly wound down, the cabin bathed in a dim red glow, the quiet after the storm. As the heavy ramp at the rear of the aircraft began to lower, Carter finally stood, adjusting his uniform. His back was straight, his expression unreadable. No distractions, no looking back. The mission wasn't about him. It never had been. A sharp gust of wind swept across the airstrip, carrying with it the scent of rain and earth, a contrast to the sterile artificiality of an airport terminal. Carter descended the ramp, his polished boots striking the metal with crisp precision. Behind him, the honor guard moved in flawless synchrony, their presence a silent testament to the respect owed to Private First Class Jason Reynolds. At the edge of the tarmac, Reynolds' family waited. His mother, Mary Reynolds, stood at the forefront, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. She was a woman carved from grief and resilience, her eyes red-rimmed but focused. Beside her, Reynolds' father stood rigid, his face set like stone, but his fingers trembled ever so slightly against the fabric of his dress jacket. And then there was his younger sister, a girl no older than 15, wrapped in a faded army jacket. Her brothers, Carter realized. The sleeves were too long for her arms. The sight of them, waiting, hoping, breaking, yet refusing to fall apart, hit Carter harder than he expected. This wasn't the first time he had done this, but it never got easier. The casket was lowered gently onto the waiting transport. The honor guard stepped back in unison, their salutes crisp, their movements precise. It was discipline. But more than that, it was reverence. Carter stepped forward, his cap tucked under one arm. Mary Reynolds met his gaze, her breath catching in her throat. She had seen him before, not in person, but on a screen. She knew what had happened. Her lips trembled, but her voice was steady. Did he suffer? The question was soft, but it cut through the night like a blade. Carter didn't hesitate. No, ma'am. Mary let out a breath, her fingers tightening around her own arms. Carter continued, his voice steady but not impersonal. This wasn't just a report. This was a truth she deserved to hear. He fought with everything he had. He protected his brothers until his last moment. And when the time came, he wasn't alone. We made sure of that. A tear finally broke free from the corner of her eye. She nodded as if committing his words to memory. Then after a long, shuddering pause, she whispered, "And his journey home?" Carter squared his shoulders. "With honor," he said firmly, "every step of the way." For the first time that night, her lips curved into something that almost resembled a smile. Not happiness, but relief. Because whatever else had happened, whoever had tried to interfere, it hadn't changed this. Her son had been brought home the right way. As the family gathered around the casket, Reynolds' sister stepped forward. Her small hands clutched a photograph. The edges were worn, creased, a memory touched too many times. She held it out. Carter took it carefully, glancing down at the image. It was of Reynolds and his squad, arms slung around each other, grinning despite the dust and exhaustion lining their faces. Carter recognized the scene. He had been there that day. The girl's voice was quiet but unwavering. "He said you were the kind of leader he wanted to be." Carter's throat tightened. Slowly he exhaled. He returned the photo to her, placing it gently into her palm, closing her fingers around it. He already was. The honor guard took their final position. The casket was secured in the military transport vehicle, its flag still crisp, still pristine. Carter lifted his right hand, a single, unwavering salute. The guards followed. The Reynolds family, standing together, placed their hands over their hearts. The vehicle pulled away. Carter did not lower his salute until it had vanished from sight, and even then he stood motionless, his posture rigid. Because the moment was not over, not until the sky itself seemed to exhale, the wind settling, the silence deepening. Only then did he take a slow step back, replacing his cap, and finally allowing himself to breathe. Mission complete. 1 week after Carter had escorted Private First Class Jason Reynolds home, the country was still talking. The video of the incident at the airport had been viewed tens of millions of times, shared across every major social media platform. It had sparked a national conversation, not just about this one moment, but about respect, accountability, and the unseen biases that live beneath the surface of everyday life. But conversations alone weren't enough. Action was happening. 1. The airline faces its consequences. The airline's attempts to control the damage had failed spectacularly. Stock prices plummeted by over 15% in the first 3 days. Corporate sponsors pulled funding, refusing to be associated with a company now synonymous with disrespecting the military. A coalition of veteran organizations filed a formal civil rights complaint, triggering a full-scale congressional investigation. Then came the final blow. A whistleblower leaked internal emails, exposing that this was not an isolated incident. It was a pattern. Screenshots of internal directives showed extra screening measures disproportionately applied to certain passengers under the vague label of security concerns. The documents didn't use explicit language, but the message was clear. Bias was built into the system. By the end of the week, the CEO of the airline had resigned under pressure. But even that wasn't enough for the public, because this wasn't just about one executive, one company. This was about a culture that had allowed this to happen in the first place, and the world was demanding more. Carter never wanted to be a public figure. He never wanted to be the face of a movement. But now, wherever he went, people recognized him. Soldiers, veterans, everyday citizens, all of them stopped to shake his hand, to thank him, to tell him that they saw what had happened, and they would never forget. The Pentagon had even reached out, inviting him to speak at a press conference regarding new airline regulations for military personnel. At first he refused, because this was never about him. But then he thought of Reynolds' mother, of how she had gripped his forearm and whispered, "Thank you," of how she had found comfort in knowing that her son had been treated with dignity, even when the system had tried to deny it. And so after days of avoiding the cameras, Carter finally agreed to speak. The press conference was held at a military base, away from the political noise of Washington, away from the corporate spin of airline executives. Carter stood behind the podium, dressed not in a suit, but in his uniform, his real uniform. The room was packed. Reporters, military officials, government representatives. The air was heavy with anticipation. Carter adjusted the microphone, took a breath. Then he spoke. "I'm not here today because I want to be. I'm here because I have to be." A hush settled over the room. A week ago, I stood in an airport terminal, being told that I couldn't board a flight, not because my paperwork wasn't in order, not because I had done anything wrong, but because of policy. He let the word hang, his voice edged with quiet steel. But here's the thing about policy. It's only as just as the people who enforce it. Murmurs rippled through the room. Carter continued. "We like to think that discrimination is something obvious, that it's loud, that it announces itself, but that's not how it works. Discrimination is quiet. It hides behind rules. It disguises itself as procedure and security and standard protocol. It counts on the fact that people won't ask questions, that they won't push back, that they'll just accept it and move on." A pause. But I didn't move on. He leaned forward slightly, his voice sharp, unwavering. And because of that, people paid attention. The cameras clicked rapidly, capturing every word, every moment. Carter exhaled, looking over the crowd. This was never about me. This was about a soldier, Private First Class Jason Reynolds, who gave his life for this country. And it should never have taken a viral video to get him the respect he was owed. Silence. And then, the final blow. Respect should not be conditional. Dignity should not be debatable. And justice should not require an audience. The room erupted. Some reporters clapped before remembering they were supposed to be neutral. Others furiously scribbled down notes. The message was clear. This moment was bigger than Carter now, and it wasn't going away. Within a month, things had started to shift. Airlines implemented new policies ensuring military personnel escorting fallen soldiers would receive priority boarding, no exceptions. The Senate hearing moved forward, pushing for stricter anti-discrimination enforcement in airline security procedures. A new federal oversight committee was formed, investigating patterns of systemic bias across major industries. But beyond the laws, beyond the policies, something else had changed. People were paying attention, because they had seen firsthand what it looked like when someone refused to back down. Months later, Carter found himself back in a quiet military office, far from the cameras, far from the noise. A stack of letters sat on his desk. Some were from soldiers, thanking him. Others were from complete strangers, telling him that his fight had reminded them to stand up for something too. He flipped through them, stopping at one he recognized immediately. Mary Reynolds, a simple note. Colonel Carter, I just wanted you to know, I visited Jason's grave today. His sister was with me. She's thinking of joining the service, you know, wants to be an officer, says she wants to be like the men her brother admired. Thank you for making sure he came home the way he deserved. We won't forget. Carter closed his eyes briefly. Then setting the letter down, he stood, straightened his uniform, and walked forward. Because the fight was never about one moment. It was about making sure no one had to fight that battle again. Respect should not be conditional, dignity should not be debatable, and justice should not require an audience. Because doing the right thing should never depend on whether the world is watching. And now, thanks to Carter, they always would be.